Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this is Labyrinths.
Most of us would assume that those who abuse children almost always face the justice they deserve, whether it be a federal conviction, landing abusers in prison for multiple years, overwhelming fines, or at the very least, lost custody. But according to Dr. Aleksandra Treglown, a child forensic interviewer, the prosecution rates for these crimes are shockingly low. Through hundreds of hours of interviewing and countless more spent on research, Dr. Treglown believes she has identified the cause of our legal system's poorest protection of children: disbelief. One note up front, Dr. Treglown frequently mentions two acronyms: SANE, which stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, and CYFD, Children, Youth, and Families Department. Enjoy.
I am a child forensic interviewer, which means that I talk with children when they have been victims or witnesses to violent or sexual crimes. And I did that full time until recently. This semester, I actually was hired as full-time faculty at a state university. So now I'm able to research the system more and try to increase prosecution rates for these crimes, which is my goal.
Yeah. Just stepping back a second, like, what a job. That's intense. How did you get into this job?
So I'm a former teacher. I used to be an elementary teacher and also K-12. I taught ESL. And when I moved to a different state, I kind of was looking for something different and something that would utilize my skills teaching and working with kids and like my expertise with children. And I saw an opening and I applied and I got it.
Wow.
Yeah. And then once that happened, once I got a little bit into that job, I realized, oh, I need to know a lot more. And so then I went and got my doctorate in criminal justice and criminology.
So that's fascinating. So the job opening was just, we need a forensic interviewer for children.
Yeah.
And were there qualifications that were required for that? So
forensic interviewing, this is part of the issue, I think, with the system is that it's like you said, it's a really, really hard job. The turnover rate is very high. The average forensic interviewer lasts, I think, like 4 years, just because it's like a lot of vicarious trauma, like from doing this job.
Of course.
And so there are a few training protocols that are kind of like the primary ones used. I'm trained in two. One is called Child First. One is the National Children's Advocacy Center. And other than those protocols, and then you do things like ongoing peer review where people watch your interviews, critique them, you critique other people's, things like that. There is no national standard for what type of education you have. Most forensic interviewers that I see come from either education, like former teachers, or social work. But technically, depending on who hires you, you could have like a high school degree or an associate's degree or anything. Some places will require masters, but it is up to the child advocacy center that hires you.
Wow.
The issue, which I saw quickly, is that when you go to court to testify, a defense attorney is going to rip you apart if you do not have a very high level of expertise.
Right.
So that was a primary consideration of why I got my doctorate, actually.
Right. So, one of the things that I saw when I was looking into your new website, so drtreglown.com, was talking about the interview process. So what does a forensic interview process with a child look like?
So in order to I guess before the interview. So let's say that you had a child, you thought that your child was being sexually abused, or they came to you and said disclosure to you. A parent cannot schedule a forensic interview. It's going to have to go through, and every jurisdiction will vary, but it is going to have to go through usually law enforcement. When all the jurisdictions I've worked in, law enforcement has been the people required to schedule the interview. There are some jurisdictions that will let CYFD like DIFUS or CPS, like schedule the interview. Kind of depends on if this is going to be sort of like a DIFUS, CYFD case, or if it's going to be a criminal case, depending on the jurisdictions. Mine, like I said, have required law enforcement to schedule it. So law enforcement will schedule it. And then the parent or guardian or whoever has custody of the child will come to the Child Advocacy Center usually. And then once they get to the Child Advocacy Center, which is set up in a child-friendly way, trauma-informed way, it shouldn't be scary. You know, it should be set up nicer than even going to like a pediatrician or something. There should be waiting areas with toys and things like that. But for the actual forensic interview, the child will be in a separate interview room with the forensic interviewer, and the parent or guardian will be in a separate waiting room. When they're waiting, they will usually meet with an advocate, and that advocate is your go-to person. If you go to court, if you need help, anything that you need, that's who you need to go to, the advocate. They can usually help you with therapy, getting services like that as well. The forensic interviewer cannot interact with the parents, really. I mean, I introduce myself to them, but you can't engage meaningfully. You can't have a relationship with them. The forensic interviewer is a neutral party.
Okay.
So you are not on anyone's side. You're not on the side of anybody. You're just a neutral fact finder. That can be very challenging when you are talking with kids in the forensic interview, because sometimes, you know, especially as a mom, there's times that you want to say comforting things or say something encouraging and you can't. So everything has to be completely just neutral. On the flip side of that, you know, I've heard very interesting things, and you react neutrally to that too. So that's also very helpful. But during the interview, the child will be in that room with the interviewer. It's soundproofed, it's recorded. There's a video, there's audio recording. You tell the child that, they know that. There's kind of, you introduce them to the room. And on the sort of usually across the hall or down the hall, there's an observation room. And the jurisdictions I've worked in, the DA is there, law enforcement's there, sometimes UAFD is there. If it's a child from a tribe, tribal representative will be there, and they're observing the interview. During the interview, you'll take a break, and then you'll kind of brainstorm with them. Is there anything else you need? Kind of things for different charges. What kind of information do they need? And then you'll go back and finish the interview with the child.
Okay. So interesting. So this is, from what I'm gathering, this is very much a mechanism of law enforcement in the sense that
yes,
yeah, so it's not like a therapeutic thing necessarily.
No, not at all. Yeah.
This is going to a forensic interviewer, even to determine even what the facts are, requires that you go and you enter into a law enforcement arena where the goal is to determine if there is a crime that has been committed and if there is a perpetrator who needs to be punished for the crime. Is that correct?
A lot of the time, it still doesn't end up in a systemic justice or an outcome where anyone is even arrested, even with a full disclosure from the child.
Interesting. So can we talk about those cases where it does go through and those cases where it doesn't? Like what determines that?
In my experience, usually the cases that have a better outcome have been, unfortunately, kids who are older and better able to testify, like teenagers.
I see.
Kids who are little, especially under like 12, under 10, it is very difficult to have charges stick. People think, I think the average person thinks, if you ask them, hey, someone off the street, my sister's child said that her stepfather, molested her or touched her, what would happen? I think the average person would say, oh, he'll be arrested and there will be a crime. He'll go to jail, go to prison. That's not usually how it works. That is the minority of what happens, unfortunately.
And that's in your experience as well, where you've been interviewing people and...
Yeah. And I have I did track like my cases and my disclosures. Like I just kind of had like age, gender, did they disclose yes or no? Was it sexual abuse, physical abuse, that type of thing? And majority of the kids did disclose, and majority there are not charges. There's a variety of reasons. Physical abuse is a really tricky one to have charges on because usually there's something called parental privilege, and that basically means you can spank your kid, you can hit your kid. It has to even leave marks. And there's probably not going to be charges.
Interesting.
I did have a case that did result in charges, and the level of violence in this case was so high. This child was talking to me normally, like he was interacting with me. He seemed fine, but he was fully disclosing, but he seemed okay. And I just felt like something was very off with him. I felt the way that his eyes were looking at me, I felt like there was something really off. So I told I've never said this before, and I said to the law enforcement officer, I said, I think this kid is going to die. Like, I think he's going to die, and I think he kind of knows that. And they actually took him immediately from the interview to an exam. He had multiple fractured bones, multiple, like, lacerated and bruised organs.
Wow.
At that moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know, like, as someone who's like a criminal reform advocate over here, like it's very interesting for me to like hear this perspective because it is like, on the one hand, as a mom and as someone who is someone who is also a indirect victim of crime, like sexual abuse against a friend of mine who was 21 years old at the time and who was murdered. I always find myself bridging these places where it's like, okay, on the one hand, I absolutely have friends who have been wrongly accused of, harming children. And on the other hand, you do not want children to be harmed, and you want to you want to protect children. And I know also you are somewhat bridging that gap as well because you teach about wrongful convictions. And so you're aware of things like cognitive bias and prosecutorial misconduct, and you're aware of cases in the past where children have been induced in interviews that were less neutral and less about fact-finding and more about just getting a certain kind of statement from them. So I'm curious to know if we can like talk about what qualifies, what makes it a good interview with a child, especially because you're right, like it's so traumatic, and kids are like, one of the things that is a huge challenge is we don't most people don't teach kids how to even communicate about these issues. I mean, I, as a 20-year-old, didn't know how to communicate that the police were making me uncomfortable, for instance. Like, you just do what an authority figure tells you to do because that's what you've been taught your entire life. And even if they're like physically abusing you or whatever, like you kind of go along with it because they're the authority figure. And so I'm putting myself in the position of a much younger version of me, or of these children who are doing the exact same thing. It's an adult. I have to do what adults say. They're my authority figure. Like, how? So talk me through how you've, I'm sure absolutely certain you've done all this research. Like, how have we learned how to do these interviews so that we don't make mistakes?
Yes, that's super important. And there are people who still to this day make mistakes in that. But to back up, I agree with you because I am a huge advocate of reform, criminal justice reform, police reform. Like you said, I created the first wrongful convictions class in my university that I teach at. I do support police. I don't believe we can live without police. However, I think we have to recognize that there are officers that do wrong things. You can't shoot somebody you can't do that. we need police reform. And there are a lot of deaf people, because my daughter is hard of hearing and deaf, like who have been shot by police who shouldn't have been. So yeah, it's really, really hard to balance because on one hand, I'm kind of like, we need to be really, really, really careful that, which what I do fully believe, to like not wrongfully convict someone, to not, use the read technique, not do those things to make someone falsely confess. But then on the other hand, we do have a problem in this country with not believing children. We have a problem with not believing women when they've been raped and sexually assaulted, but we have a much larger problem not believing children when they tell us that. So it is very hard to be in. And as far as I know, I'm the only person in my state that this is my specialty, researching. No one likes to do it because it's not great. It's not a fun thing to research because the outcome isn't what we want.
Right.
So you kind of don't want to talk about it.
Right. And also I feel like maybe sort of everyone doesn't like you ultimately. Like it's also kind of that where it's like, the prosecution may want you to be getting more and you're like, well, I have to be neutral. And then other people might be like, well, you're, so I could see it being, you sort of being attacked on all sides. And really your job is to sit back and just figure out what happened.
I totally feel like that. I even feel like the child doesn't necessarily like me because I'm not affirming, which I do want to be, but I can't be because that would be that you would ruin the case. So,
right.
But yes, you have to be neutral. And also, as you just pointed out, when you are in that mid session, like mid forensic interview brainstorming session with the DA and law enforcement and even CYFD, regularly, there are times that they will say, ask this. And I will say, no, I'm not asking that. Or I might say, okay, I'm going to ask that, but what are you trying to get at? And then they'll tell me what they're trying to get at. And then I'll restructure, I'll sort of try to get at it a different way. You do have to be completely neutral.
Okay.
I actually can't even ask about anything that's not directly in the police report at all. So you start the process, the protocol that I follow, you introduce the room to them, you tell them, I don't call them rules, but basically what you tell them, I say, hey, this is a forensic interview. This is different than talking to a teacher or another adult. When you're talking to me, if I say something wrong, if I repeat what you say and it's not right, I want you to correct me. So I'll usually say, oh, did you go to school today? Tell me what you did the whole day, from the beginning to the middle to the end. Tell me everything. And that lets them practice the way that they need to talk about like the crime that occurred. And it also lets me gauge kind of what type of details, how does this kid normally talk? Some kids give so many details and some kids just don't. And you can kind of see how they normally speak. And after that, we'll go through who's in your family. Usually when that happens, a lot of times they'll bring up on their own why they're there. If they don't, I'll say, tell me why you came here today. And usually they know why. Sometimes they don't. And if they don't know why, then I will say, well, kids come here to make sure that they're safe and that their body's safe. What do you think about that? And then I'll go through, I'll say, like, do you have body rules? Tell me what your body rules are. And then if they still haven't disclosed anything, I'll say, tell me, has anyone broken your body rules? And usually you can tell the kids whose parents have talked to them and not talked to them about body rules. You can see who's more comfortable. If you talk to my kids, 4 of my kids are adults, but my one child is 10. I mean, they're going to say vagina, penis, like those kind of words. It varies by culture. Who's going to say what, but you can start to see how uncomfortable a child will get if they don't even have a word.
Right.
Sometimes they don't have a word.
Right.
And so at the very, very, very last resort, and this rarely has to happen, I will say something like, let's say they came in and the allegation was that like their uncle touched them. I might say something like, well, someone told me about your uncle. Do you have something to tell me? Tell me something about that.
Okay.
And that's it. And if they don't say anything, then they don't say anything. And all questions are structured. Like if you don't know how to ask a question, say, tell me. Just say, tell me. So I would not say something like, does your mom hit you when you get in trouble? Like, that's crazy. I would not phrase it like that. I would say, tell me what happens when you get in trouble.
Okay. Got it. Got it.
So yeah, you have to be neutral at all at all costs.
One of the fun things that I do with my daughter, who is 3, is we'll come into the vocal booth together just to like have a little, Eureka podcast session, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll do things a little bit like that, like tell me about your day. And she'll just wander off and either say nothing or say something imaginary, like Drago, her toy Drago flew in the sky today. And I'm trying to imagine just how like difficult this conversation can be, especially depending upon the cognitive ability of the kid. So like typically, I mean, are you interviewing anyone from between the ages of like 1 and 18? Like, is it anyone that's under 18 that you're in charge of speaking to?
Yeah, if they can talk, yes. So there are kind of guidelines that you can use. So for kind of in general, like the younger they are, if they're like 3, your sentencing and your question is going to be maybe like 3 or 4 words. So you're going to restructure the way that you say it. They will go off and talk about things like random, all sorts of things. And I let that happen because if you you have no idea what they're going to say. Also, you have to go into it. I've read the police report. I have talked to the law enforcement or the CYFD. I've talked to them. It doesn't matter. I'm still going in totally neutral. You have no idea what that kid is going to say.
Mm-hmm.
No clue. And sometimes the allegation is true, but it's not true the way it's being presented. So I had two boys and they were not older, but they were a lot older than your daughter. And the allegation was that the older brother stuck his finger up the younger brother's butt. And the teacher reported because the little brother went to school and said, "Oh, I can't sit down. My butt hurts. Like my brother stuck his finger up his butt, not my butt." So they came in and that is what happened. However, it was not like sexual abuse. It turns out that they were both really, really big fans of this anime. And there's this, I can't remember what it's called. I did Google it in the mid session. We started Googling like, what is this?
Yeah.
And it's called like Thousand Fingers of Death, 1,000 Years of Death, something like that. And it's a hand like motion. And in the anime, the character like runs and jumps and does that like up someone's butt and they kind of like fly away. And so the brothers had been doing that back and forth to each other. And it was like a regular back and forth thing. But this one time, the older brother did it too hard. Like it hurt him.
Wow.
And that's what happened. So like, you don't want to go in, like you just have no idea. So I always let them wander and talk, and then I will bring it back. When they stop talking, I don't interrupt. And my interviews are long, which maybe law enforcement doesn't love, but that's because I won't interrupt them. I let them talk and I'll bring it back. And if your daughter said something like, "Oh, my dragon flew in the sky," I would clarify and I would say, "Is that real or is that play?" And then she would say, "This is play." And then I would say, "Oh, okay, we're only going to talk about real things here." And if she can't distinguish that at all, then the interview, she's too little. Like it's not super useful.
Right.
Because you have to sort of weigh the trauma of having them come into a forensic interview with the usefulness of it in court. And that sounds sort of sad, but if she can't stay within reality, then a defense attorney is going to say, "Oh, well, see this interview? She can't stay with, she's making this up."
Right. Or it's just it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. Right. Okay. So how long have you been doing this, by the way?
I started interviewing in 2020.
Okay. So you're far along in this. How many children do you think you've interviewed over the course of 5 years?
Definitely hundreds. If I was in a bigger area, it would be way more than that. I'm in a rural jurisdiction. And I've been in a couple different ones and I've always been in a rural area. So hundreds I've interviewed. And there's patterns that you see. And I will say too, in all of the interviews that I've had one that I have felt like this mom this is nothing happened. You know, something weird is going on here. And that's a really big problem because, as I said before, and like one of the central sort of themes of that ties all my research together, because I kind of go from child sex abuse to domestic violence to rape, like to femicide. And as I was sitting having to write down my 5-year research plan for tenure, I thought, I know this all goes together, but how can I explain this? You know, how can I explain how this all works? And the central theme is disbelief. It's disbelief. And even you, as someone being wrongfully convicted, it's disbelief, like disbelieving what you are saying.
Right.
And I believe that the disbelief of women and children, specifically, because that's my area, is systemic violence against them. Because when kids disclose, or when moms say, hey, my child did disclose, you might be surprised to find out that actually the rate of the abuser, when it's the father getting custody, seriously increases. And the mom often loses custody.
Really?
Yeah. And so, and that's research that was done in 2019 across the country. And
wait, so can you qualify that? So there's an allegation of abuse that leads to a custody battle.
Yes.
And the person who was accused of the abuse ends up getting custody of the kids?
Yes. Only when it's the father. It doesn't work when it's reversed.
Okay.
And that ties into the central theme of like just not believing women. So when it is a case of a father, the allegation is against the father, and the mother goes to court and says, my husband, ex-husband, father of my child, is abusing my child or children. I don't want, like, we need to look into this or anything, you know, I don't want him to have custody, things like that. 59% of the time, I have it right here, 59% of the time, the father's got sole custody.
Really? And is that because they then go through the process of forensic interviewing or whatever, and they don't bring a case against the father, and then that's used against the mom as if she's like...
This study is similar to the way I structure my studies, is that it's cases that the abuse ended up being proven.
Okay.
So that's why I like this, because that's kind of the way that I structure my studies, because with this theme of disbelief, there's always he said, she said, and they never believe she said.
Right.
So in these cases, so what they did was they looked at what was called turnaround cases.
Okay.
And in a turnaround case is a case where there was an initial allegation of abuse, and then they weren't believed. And then years down the road, oops, it turns out, yeah, it was proven. And then they were believed.
Okay.
So in these cases where it was absolutely proven that there was abuse, in the initial time, when the first allegation came up, when the mom was saying this, 59% of moms lost custody.
Wow.
And a lot of them were some of them were even threatened. If you file anything else, you will lose all contact with your kid.
Oh, Jesus.
And the average time that these kids ended up in the custody of their abusive father was over 3 years. The longest one was 9 years.
Wow.
And throughout this time, these kids ended up having their suicidal ideations went up threefold. Their depression went up. They did have medical evidence. There were things. Basically, the moms, unfortunately, had to appeal, and that costs a lot of money.
Right.
So they had to have money, and they had to be able to appeal. They had to be able to hire experts. And these kids, some of them had to advocate for themselves. Some of the older kids had to basically take on this legal burden on their own. And in the end of these specific cases, that it was all founded. And so that's why it was a really good study, because we know for a fact that it happened. And so that's what's very unfortunate, is even when kids are disclosing, people aren't believing them.
Right. I mean, and especially that's I'm turning a lot of things around in my head, because I'm remembering even just being if I'm putting myself in the position of a mom who is convinced that the dad is doing something to their kid and they're like, I need to get out of this situation now. And he has the right to be around them because he's the dad. And oh my God. And then you
Yeah.
go and you go to law enforcement and you try to get support, but then that turns around against you. And then like, I'm even just thinking back to what you said about even just this whole forensic interview process is tied in with law enforcement. And so, like, there's this, I could imagine the mom having this fear of even like going to do a forensic interview because they're thinking, well, what if I'm punished for having gone to law enforcement? Like, how do we juggle all of these things?
I don't have the solution. I don't know. And like, what's interesting, speaking of the forensic interviews, is that these judges, there were cases in this study where CYFD founded the allegations of abuse. And they just said, it doesn't, nope, we're ignoring that. And we just aren't believing that happened. And they gave custody to the father. And the women, I believe in the study, it was 2/3 of the moms, they were what they were calling pathologized by the court. So they were classified as narcissistic, as manipulative, as enmeshed with their children. And you can imagine how frustrating and scary that is if you're a mom who you believe, your child has said this to you, and there's literally nothing you can do. Because if you keep doing this, you are viewed as combative, and you are viewed as someone that can't co-parent, and you will probably lose custody.
Wow.
So it's very, very frustrating. But I would like to add, for any parent, you shouldn't be scared to take your kid to a forensic interview as long as you haven't done anything crazy. They will ask, a question that I always ask, and I believe every forensic interviewer asks, is, who talked to you about coming here today? Like, we're trained to see if a child has been coached. That is something that we're trained in. And we will ask those questions. Also with kids, generally, when parents, if they are coaching them, and you start the way that you have to get these forensic details out of a kid if a crime has occurred, they're like not equipped or prepped with those types of details. And it's pretty evident that they really weren't there when this thing happened, if it didn't happen. And also, all forensic interviewers will also interview child offenders. Well, I'm sorry, that was actually the wrong word. That's like not the right word. Children with problematic sexual behaviors used to be called child offenders. The reason we don't want to label them as offenders, even if they have sexually abused another child, we will forensically interview them. We are not looking for the details. We will not even talk about the details of what they did to another child. When we talk to that child, we'll ask for those details. But when we talk to this child, we are going to find out if they're safe, like what's happened to them. So a lot of times when there's two kids in a house, if one does sexually touch the other one, you see a parent who's like, okay, you can talk to the little one, but like not the big one, right? I don't want them to get in trouble. We're not looking to get that child in trouble. That kid is there. It's called a safety interview. We're just making sure like they're okay, because at certain ages, it's not appropriate for a child to be acting sexually. So we want to know like where they learned it. A lot of kids now have seen porn.
Right.
So that's very common.
That's a source of, yes, because I can imagine like in the past, that would have been a sign that kid was potentially a victim of abuse, because where else would they be learning it? But now there's the internet, and they're,
it's usually something, right? It's not usually just on their own they came up with it. It's usually something. The other thing we're looking for with kids is that they're explaining things in a kid way, right? Not in an adult way. Like, I don't expect, let's say, one common way that I've seen kids explain porn that aren't like of a sexual age, is that they'll say, yeah, they showed me TV with naked people. And I'll say, oh, tell me about that. And they'll say, often what I'll hear is they'll say, they were making babies
Hmm.
because they don't get like another, they kind of maybe at that age where they know how a baby is made, but they don't understand there's other purposes,
Right.
for sex.
Right.
So we look for those child ways that they explain things.
What a thing to deal with every day. Going back to your point and the big point of your work, which is this problem of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
Your job is, which is so interesting because again, you're this neutral fact finder, right? Your job isn't to go in there and be even affirmative to the kid. It's just
Mm-hmm.
to hear from them and to communicate to them in the most neutral way possible, to encourage them to just say what they know and not to potentially
Mm-hmm.
give them cues about what you want to hear or anything like that. And so when they say something to you, you're not even supposed to emotionally react to it. You're just,
Mm-hmm.
you're as scientific as possible,
Yeah.
as objective as possible. So it's not really your job to believe or disbelieve. It's your job to receive information if it is forthcoming, right? And to encourage an environment where information sharing is safe and accessible to the kid.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So where are you seeing the disbelief factor coming in?
Unfortunately, it's often with law enforcement.
Okay. Talk to me about that. So you have your break, you go back into the room with the DA or the law enforcement people, and what is that conversation like?
I see it more with outside people who maybe aren't trauma informed. Because a lot of times, so kids don't just usually, kids and adults, but usually kids don't disclose immediately. They don't get touched and then come and tell you. A lot of times they don't even understand and they can't process and they don't even know what it meant, or they kind of don't know if it's wrong or right, especially if it's been normalized.
Right.
So there's oftentimes a really large gap in time. And a lot of people, even working in the field, don't get that. They sort of take that as, well, if it happened to me, it's the same thing with false confessions. If it was me and I was interviewed or interrogated, I would never falsely confess to something I didn't do. It's like that, but the flip side. It's like, well, if it was me and I was raped, I would tell immediately.
If I was 5 and I, do you remember what being 5 was like? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And we know that research is very, very, very strong telling us that when kids are sexually abused by a parent, it's the more authority they have over you, the far less likely they are to disclose and very likely to recant. So maybe they'll disclose, but then they'll take it back. And so that is much, much more likely if it's a father or a stepfather that's doing it versus a teacher.
Got it.
Something like that.
Got it.
So it's the disbelief. I've actually heard verbatim from a detective that I worked with after I had a child fully disclose rape very graphically. I went in on the break and he said to me, her word is not enough.
So do you think that the from what I'm hearing from that, though, is not necessarily that the detective doesn't believe her, but that he can't make a case based solely on her testimony?
That's a great interpretation of that. In that case, he did not believe her because he basically said, I'm paraphrasing. What he said was, I don't want to turn his life upside down and investigate him based on her word. And
then why go through the forensic interview process at all?
I don't know. Exactly. And so what he could have said, if that was the case, because in another interpretation of that statement, her word is not enough.
Right.
That is true. Right. Oftentimes that is true. So then I would say, okay, well, what can we do? And on the flip side, I've worked with other law enforcement officers who are so good. I actually had a teenager who didn't disclose, but she invert, because she felt like she was in love with him. And he was in his 30s, and she was a very young teenager. So she wouldn't disclose, but she was inadvertently giving clues because she was saying all these great things he does for her and all these gifts he gives her and all these things. Like, it wasn't normal.
Right.
Like, it wasn't appropriate. And so we knew it, but we couldn't prove it, and she wouldn't say it because she loved him.
Right.
And that detective, let me tell you, he would not give up. He got subpoenas. We got enough information from the forensic interview to get phone subpoenas. He got subpoenas, couldn't get in the phone. They couldn't get cracked. Like, he took it all the way. He finally got that phone cracked and got all the evidence he needed. And like, a lot of other detectives would not have done that. They would have said, she doesn't want to talk. I don't want to deal with it. He really went above and beyond. And he got it. He got what he was looking for. And there was photographs. There was all sorts of stuff on there. So
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, because I mean, and ideally in a situation, you would want to pursue everything you could to prove it.
There are many times when kids who are being sexually abused still have love for their abuser, especially if it's a family member.
Of course. Yeah.
So they are conflicted on getting them in trouble. And then, like the other one, you have a lot of times young teenage girls who are 13 or 14 or maybe 15, and the offender is like 30, and they swear like he's going to marry them, he loves them, and they don't want to talk. And I had a case that went well, and he ended up getting many years in prison, one of the rare cases. And this child would not tell she would not disclose. She refused. She would not talk to anyone. But all of the people talking to her were men. Like, the CYFD worker was a man, the officer was a man, and they kept telling her, you're a victim. You're a victim, and she did not want to hear that. So when she had an opportunity to sit with me, and I wasn't telling her she's a victim, I was just saying, well, tell me what happened. Okay, well, tell me about this and tell me about that. It took a very long, that interview was like very, very long.
What's a long interview? I'm just curious.
It was like almost 3 hours. It was very long. Like, usually it's hour and a half, usually. Kids are very tired afterwards.
Sure.
But with her, we weren't talking about it. Like, we weren't talking about that for 85% of the interview. We were talking about other things, like other things sort of surrounding that thing, but not that thing. And she just kept telling me. Now, if she had said, I will not talk to you, then that would have been it. I would have, but she wasn't saying that.
Right.
She wasn't saying no, and she wasn't saying I won't answer that. She wasn't saying I won't talk to you. She just kept changing the subject. So I kept letting her change the subject. And then eventually she did start to say more things. And finally I said to her, okay, because she got mad and she said, well, this CYFD worker, she called him by his name, and she said, he told me I'm a victim. I'm not a victim. And I said, okay, tell me about that. And she told me, and she said, these days men can get in trouble even when you consent, which was definitely something that he had said to her. And I said, oh, okay, well, tell me about that. Tell me what you consented to. And then she told me everything.
Going back to the issue of disbelief, and you've looked into it. You're right. Like, disbelief is a hugely traumatizing thing, right? Like, the fact that I'm still attempting to prove that the police abused me in my interrogation and people don't believe me is deeply, deeply traumatizing. And I want to know if so it has an impact, first of all, on if cases even get prosecuted, right? What are some of the other impacts of disbelief that you study? Or is your area of study like on whether or not cases are even prosecuted?
That's the phase that I'm in right now. I am working on sort of this new project. I'm hoping to finish it this summer. I'm working on it right now. I can't say the cases because I'm looking at commentary and I don't want anyone to go add to the commentary on accident. But I'm looking at basically public commentary, like of disbelief of cases of rape. And because why does this matter? This matters because these are our jury members, right? What we're going to see. So we can have the most perfect detective, the perfect DA, perfect forensic interviewer, or if it's an adult, perfect sane nurse, perfect anything. The whole system can be perfect and it can go to court and it can be a great case. But no matter what, how much work we do, if everyone's trauma informed and everyone's amazing, you're still going to get to court and you're still going to have a jury. And if they're not, you're still not going to get an outcome of what you think that it should be. And so I started looking at cases of proven rape. So these were with adults. And they were proven by video and proven by confession. And so I looked at cases where it was male offender, female victim, and then also flipped. And when it was the male offender, the female victim, even though this offender confessed, he is pled guilty to multiple felonies. He is on the sex offender registry, and there is video. The public commentary, because I do think it did affect it because he was young and handsome and white. The public commentary is that they do not believe she was a victim. They believe that she manipulated him, that she benefited from being raped, and that he's too young. It's not his fault. How can he know? He can't control his hormones. And it's basically she's not a worthy victim. But his wife is a worthy victim. So his wife is worthy. And I do believe that she's also a victim, but like we can have lots of victims here, but we do have we do have the victim who was raped. And it's just a total disbelief that she even endured anything. I mean, there was elements of people saying she enjoyed it.
Okay. Can we unpack that for a little bit? Because there's a few things that you suggested as one of the public responses to a proven rape. One is that the victim manipulated the perpetrator into committing the crime. So somehow the victim orchestrated her own victimization.
Yes. And I will say, so this was a prison case, but they all are the ones that I'm looking at. And the reason I was looking at that is because of the video element.
Got it.
We have it on tape, and also we have PREA, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So any sexual contact of any kind from any prison staff member to an inmate is considered sexual assault, no matter what.
I see.
I chose it because I know a lot about PREA because I worked in prison. And I know that when you work in prison, every single staff member, it is literally trained. You know this from day one about what PREA is. You cannot have sex with inmates. Like, this is crazy. You can't do that. They can't consent. So I took those cases. So I do believe that was a huge element of it, of her being an inmate. So she's unworthy. And we don't care.
Right. Got it.
And for him. And so, and they believe, although in no way in the post, so I took these comments are from social media posts. And there was about 800 comments on this, and I've analyzed all of them. So in this particular post, there's nowhere that it says anything of the circumstances. It just says what the charges were, that he pled to it, and it has his face. And everyone insists, they all believe it happened because he did plead guilty, but they all insist that she made him do it. All of them, with so many of the comments.
So that's super interesting because it's not even about disbelief per se, because it's not that they're saying we see that there's video proof and we just we just don't believe it's an AI, someone doctored, the video. No, like it happened, but now we're saying it's not a crime what happened.
Yeah, yes, they're literally saying that it's not a crime. And it's almost disbelief flipped. It's almost disbelief of him being an offender. Right. So, but yeah, that's what they're saying. The many comments would say, fire him. It's not a crime. Oh, he broke company policy. It is a crime. It's a federal crime.
Yeah, no, as someone who's been on the other side of those bars,
Can't do that.
Okay.
I also took a case and I have flipped case.
Okay.
Where it's a female guard. And she's also, so it's like the same section of the country. She's about the same age. She's also white. And like her picture, her mugshot looks very similar to his. Like the facial expressions are similar.
Oh, so weird.
Because I thought like a lot of people commented on, well, he's sad. So I wanted to make it as close as possible so that I could make a really close comparison. Because there was another female guard that I was looking at, but she had a very different facial expression. And I didn't want, and she also wasn't white. So I didn't want to like.
Yeah, have those other factors. Yeah.
There's racial factors, there's other factors. So I had this other case. And so I've gone through every comment on hers. It has about the same amount of comments from about the same area in the country. Not one person said that this male inmate manipulated her.
Huh.
So it doesn't work both ways. But they do say that she's disgusting and gross, the guard, but no one said that he was gross. And people are thanking the sheriff for arresting her. There's like a big theme in hers. And in his, no one is thanking the sheriff for arresting him. They're saying, hey, why is he being arrested?
Right. Like, if anything, he should have just been fired because he, apparently just couldn't keep it in his pants at work.
Yeah. Like that's normal.
Boys will be boys.
That's literally what was said. Yeah.
So what is this like? Just one of the other things that like just sort of pinged for me that it makes me just is very triggering for me is this idea that somehow a victim benefited. Like the commentary is, well, even if they were victimized, they benefited from it. As if, what does that mean? What does that commentary suggest?
They were saying, so in this case, they were saying, okay, a feather in her cap, another notch on her belt. Like she got one, she got a guard. That's one of them. That's a few comments like that. A few other comments were about, she's going to get a payday. She did this to get money. Other comments were, she's going to be released. She's so happy. She's going to get out of prison now. And that's not how it works. If she was in jail and she had like 12 months, yeah, maybe they would say, hey, we're letting you out. If she's in for life or some very long-term sentence, she's not being released because this happened.
Right.
That's not happening.
Right.
But there is just this belief that she wanted it.
Huh. So she's we shouldn't feel bad for her and we shouldn't think of her. That's so interesting. Are you able to tell where these comments are coming from? Like who is even commenting?
So I can't. So one thing that I'm tracking is I've tracked the comment, the reactions to the comment. So not just likes, but like laughing reactions, mad reactions, like those types of reactions. Tracked the commenter's name, and I've tracked the gender of the commenter. I can't track. Not everybody says where they're from, but where this was posted was a southern state. Like the page came from a southern state. So, and when I looked and I could see where people were from, they were primarily coming from that area.
Right. They would be aware of it anyway. Yeah.
So I would argue that both of these, and this is something I'm going to bring up in my paper, is that primarily what we're seeing are these commenters are primarily conservative and southern. Okay. And primarily white.
Okay.
Which is kind of good because the offenders are also white. And
so it's southern. Like technically peers.
Yeah. And the other very sad thing that I'm seeing, as a feminist, like this is very sad to see, we have to acknowledge this, is that the women are harsh. commenters on the female offender. So we're seeing, like, in the male, when he's the offender, we're seeing the men and the women defend him. But when it's the female offender, we are not really seeing men defend her, and we're seeing women like attack her. Essentially, they're the ones that are saying she's nasty, she's gross, like she's disgusting, and that's really sad. And to take it back to child sex abuse, the offenders are primarily men. It is vast majority are men. However, women do hold up this abuse. Like, they might not be doing the abuse, but there are a lot of mothers who do not believe their kids and continue to put them in the situation. A lot. So we likewise, yes, we have a different responsibility. Maybe we're not doing these offenses as much, but we are really defending men a lot of times and coming down on women in a way that you don't do on men. It's just it was just an interesting observation.
I'm curious to know, like, as someone who studies these issues and is particularly concerned with the problem of disbelief, how do you feel about juggling skepticism and disbelief? Like, the responsibility of being skeptical and the responsibility and the damage that disbelief does.
Yes. So I think, I'm a very skeptical person by nature. Very skeptical of, in general, the government, the systems, the way things happen. So I'm very, very skeptical. What I would argue, I think it's much, much simpler if we take it to kids. If we just think about kids, that is primarily what I'm thinking about, is that I do think we should default believe kids. Kids generally are not making up this information. We do have research that proves that. If a kid in fact, we actually have research that proves kids actually lie about it happening, like, to protect the abuser. Like, they will deny that it happened in cases that are proven. Like I said, I like these cases because it takes out the ambiguity. So there have been studies of kids that have presented to medical facilities with STDs, with gonorrhea. And they eliminated all kids that could have had it from birth, like birth canal, like that type of situation, or were old enough to be sexually active.
Right.
And so you had just these, like, mid kids that were, like, your daughter's age to, like, 10, maybe, like, little, like, in the middle, like, they can't be having sex and they've been born too long to suddenly have this STD. And we know, according to the American Pediatrics Association, like, that if a child that age has an STD, they have been sexually abused. Only like 47% of those kids disclosed abuse. The rest denied it, even when having an STD. So most kids would rather protect the abuser or say that it didn't happen or feel uncomfortable with disclosing, because it is very, very difficult to talk about. Like, who wants to talk about it? No one even wants to talk about me, my research at work, like, let alone actual kids that, like, people don't want to talk about it. So what I would say is that when a child is saying that, we need to default believe them and do an investigation. And I think if we did that, that would be much better, because, or even coming from a place of neutrality, that would be better, as opposed to, adults, they'll say lots of things like, oh, well, their story changed. Like, they said it this way, then they said it this way. Well, kids don't process events and they can't recall memory the same way adults can. It's not the same, and trauma does impact the way you recall things.
Oh, God, just by the way, this is just a between the you and me thing. Just like the idea of, like, kids recalling memory. Like, I just got my daughter's first or most recent review from her preschool, where they give they say, oh, what's going on? What sort of friendships is she developing? What are her curiosities? And they said that the thing that my daughter is really curious about right now is asking her friends about if they have memories, because she as
super interesting.
So I was fascinated because I was like,
that's super interesting.
right? There's a certain point when you realize that there are things in your brain that you didn't have before, and they're memories. And she didn't so she's figuring out that she has these things, and she's curious about if her friends have these things. And it's I don't know if you, anyway, sorry, that just is what.
That's very advanced thinking. That's very advancst thinking for 3.
Really?
That's super interesting.
I mean, she's about to turn 4, so I don't want to
that's super interesting. It's like metacognition of thinking of thinking.
Yes, right.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So kids aren't robots. They're not going to just beep boop bop, disclose all facts the same way every time.
Right.
And so
in fact, adults, by the way, are not even.
Don't get into that, right? So, but we're and some investigators, they want a child to be able to say, oh, it was May 3rd. And I was 7. So that's when it was. You can't do that. So I would try to date things with kids in ways of important events to them. Was it near Halloween? Was it near your birthday?
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as adults, that is different. I do think the burden should be much higher. I am very concerned with wrongful convictions. We have a problem. I mean, I think if we have one person that's wrongfully convicted, that's a huge problem. That's very traumatizing. Just not being believed, if something happened to you, flip side is true. If you didn't do it and they're not believing you, that's just as traumatizing.
Yeah.
So it would be traumatizing to be accused of something that heinous that does have a social stigma if you didn't do it. I would argue, as someone that's in the system, that there are a lot of safeguards in place, especially with kids. I don't know as much about adults, but with kids they go to the they'll have a SANE exam, even if it's late, even if it's delayed, they'll still have an exam. They'll have a forensic interviewer who's trained to know, have they been coached? Have they not been coached? What's a normal way for them to talk? They'll go through these different, phases. So I think for kids, the bar is lower. For adults, the bar should be higher. But we still have to remember it's very difficult to talk about sexual abuse at any age. And something that I do with my students that all want to be police officers, I do this little activity. And I will say, okay, so here's what we're going to do today. So we're going to have partners, and we're going to have a listener, and we're going to have a speaker. And we're going to have, you're going to take turns coming in front of the room. And the listener is going to ask the speaker about the last time that you had sex. And the speaker is going to tell them, and the listener is going to ask all sorts of questions. We need to know where your clothes were, what your body was like. We need to know what body parts touched. We need to know how you felt. We're going to ask all these questions, and then the speaker has to tell that, okay? And so I go through and explain it, and of course everyone's panicking. And then I'm okay, just kidding. Obviously we're not doing that. That's super crazy. We're not doing that. But imagine if we did. Okay, now imagine that you're a young woman or a child or anything like that, and you're having to talk about that was violent, that was not consensual, to a law enforcement officer who is a person of authority. Can you think of a reason they might not want to tell you all the details? Or, we talk about that. Because, so even adults, it's not like adults, men and women. And I would argue that the rate of men being raped is a lot higher than we know, because men really don't like to talk about it. And it's a problem for everybody. We don't want that to happen. We don't want, anyone to experience that. So, I would say that we definitely need to be skeptical. However, we do need to balance that with understanding what trauma is and how that impacts how people explain things and how people talk, and the way that they might be able to process what's happening.
You can read Dr. Treglown's work at www.drtreglown.com.
In the meantime, get lost with us. Find us on Bluesky at amandaknox.com.
At wisecracker.bsky.social.
You can learn more about our work and how to support it at amandaknox.com. And please tell your friends, share on social media, and leave us a 5-star review.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us. Our managing producer is Andre Sapp, our assistant producer is Charlie Darnell, and our theme music is by Josh Udo Karp.